Good evening. Johnny, good? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Whittaker. I'm the Director of Strategic Content at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. On behalf of the Council, thank you all for joining us this evening. We're very excited to have partnered with WBEZ again this evening, and they'll be recording tonight for an installment of Worldview. Because of the recording, you may see some small differences to our typical format, including a few short musical intermissions and a possible re-recording of short segments of the program. So consider this a behind-the-scene looks at the world of public radio. Please know that we are on the record this evening. We're live streaming. Please silence your phones. That's especially important tonight because we're recording. Views expressed by individuals we host of their own do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. Thank you for our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you're not a member, please consider joining. There are many different levels of membership for you to choose from. The discussion this evening will be followed by audience Q&A. Another slight difference, we'll have a microphone in the middle of the room. You can stand there, ask a question. We'll also take questions online through our browser-launched app. That's at chi.cnf.io. Put that into your browser. It's on the screens over there. And you can ask a question. You can vote on questions too. Now, by way of a very brief introduction, our speaker this evening is Yascha Mounk. He's a lecturer on government at Harvard University, a senior fellow in New America's Political Reform Program, and author of the new book, The People versus Democracy, which will be available for sale and signing over there after the program. Yascha is in conversation with Jerome McDonald, the host of WBEZ's long-running global affairs program, Worldview. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Yascha Mounk and Jerome McDonald back to the Council.
Thanks a lot, Ian, and it's great to be back at the Council. Thanks for having us again. It's fun to be in front of live people. I am going to do some things like I'm not in front of live people this evening, like identify Yascha to the listeners who have just tuned in once in a while. Don't be surprised. I know you all know who he is. And we're also going to record 15 seconds of ambient noise here. You would be surprised how handy ambient noise is in editing. And so it's going to be like prayer-like, and we're going to have a moment of silence, and then we'll fire up the music, and we'll try to start the show, and I'll try to do it in the first take and not mess it up.
Can I suggest that we call this 15 seconds of silence for good taste and propriety?
Welcome to Worldview from WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonald. Polls say the share of Americans who'd like a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections went up for 2 straight decades. After Trump, the fight for liberal democracy got real. Coming to you at the Council on Global Affairs before a live audience, I'll talk with Yascha Mounk, the author of The People versus Democracy. Don't forget, you can find us on Twitter at WBEZ Worldview. It's great to be back at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. And it's great to be here with Yascha Mounk. He's been out there banging the drum for liberal democracy as hard as anyone. His new book is The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. And you might have heard him at Slate at the Good Fight podcast. He hosts that, and he writes there at Slate as well. Yascha's a lecturer in government at Harvard and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. Great to see you and great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
I opened with that quote about Americans who want a strongman leader going up for 2 decades, and I understand that it's gone down just a niche. You had a little article about that on Slate recently, and I'm kind of worried about all the statistics you lay out in the book. It's just one after another that sound really grim. People want a strong leader, apparently. Why is that?
Yes, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, what we're seeing is this real challenge to how political scientists, journalists, citizens used to think about the world. The basic assumption that I grew up with was that once democracies had been in place for a while, once you changed governments for free and fair elections a couple of times, and once they were reasonably affluent, once they had more than about $14,000, $15,000 GDP per capita in today's terms, they were safe. So when you looked at Kenya, which is currently going through a real struggle to preserve its democracy, that wasn't surprising because it wasn't that affluent, right? When you looked at the consolidation of authoritarian rule in China, that wasn't that surprising either because we knew that not every authoritarian country necessarily transitions to democracy. But what wasn't supposed to happen was that in countries like Hungary, democracy is really in mortal danger right now. What wasn't supposed to happen is that in countries like the United States, a greater and greater share of citizens started to say, hey, you know what, this system really isn't working for me. I'm actually really annoyed with how the system is working. So you know what, perhaps we should try something new.
One of the other scary stats is Army rule. In 1995 in the US, 1 in 16 thought Army rule was a good idea. And then in 2011, 1 in 6. That's bad.
It is. Well, I think it shows, so you have to ask yourself, why is it that our political system was so stable for many decades, and now suddenly it seems to be less stable, right? And it seems to me that there are 3 big ways in which the world of today is different from what the world looked like in the United States, say, in 1970, 1975. The first is that there's been this real stagnation of living standards for ordinary people. So from 1945 to 1960, the living standard of the average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. And you know what? Since 1985, it's been flat. It's been stagnant. That really changes how people think about politics. Whenever I used to love politicians, whenever I used to say, hey, people in Washington, D.C. are paragons of moral virtue. But they said, hey, you know what? In the end, I'm twice as rich as my parents were. My kids are going to be twice as rich as me. So let's give them the benefit of a doubt. Now they say, hey, I've worked really hard all my life. I don't have all that much to show for it. My kids might be worse off than me. So let's try something new. How bad could things get?
You point to living standards as being a big issue, and you do in the book go into income inequality, political capture, the things that were here, money in politics, campaign reform. How much does all that ball up with you in the living standards issue as the big you've got 3 big drivers, and it's not all campaign finance reform or something.
No, so I mean, I think, that empirical observation a political scientist had, that once you're an affluent society, your democracy is basically safe, didn't look at how people's sense of well-being actually developed, right? And it's one thing to say, I remember what life was like when I was a kid, and I never expected to be doing as well as I am now. That gives you this bottom line trust in the political system, right? Like, in the end, politicians seem to be sticking to their end of a deal, right? And I think that's going away. And so to me, what's more important in some ways than the absolute level of wealth, and what's more important even than inequality, is that sense of, I'm not getting what I deserve. The system is rigged against me, and you know what? I really need to swap out, drain the swamp, swap out everybody who's there, because that's the only thing that's actually going to make the system reactive to me. Now, that's made even worse by the fact that people have a feeling that the political system isn't listening to them. So the outcome really matters. The fact that you look at your pocketbook and you feel like, hey, it's not improving, that gives you the anger. But then you look around and you say, you know what? Congress does seem to be captured, right? Money does have far too big a role in our politics. There's this revolving door between lobbyists and legislators. Congressmen spend up to 50% of their time dialing numbers for cash, right? Speaking to donors. So obviously, by the time they vote in Congress on a particular law, it's not that they're going against their conscience, that they're saying, I'm going to vote down this bill even though I think it's right, because otherwise I'm not going to get the campaign contribution. Is that they spend so much of the time around the donor class that they actually understand the concerns and the preferences, and they don't necessarily understand the concerns and the preferences of ordinary people. So, you know, when people say, hey, nobody's listening to me anyway, so let's try something new, part of the analysis is right.
We're having this moment with gun control where many people would like to see gun control, huge majorities of people would like to see gun control, but we don't get it. And this is in microcosm of what is happening on a whole range of issues. There are issues where it seems that we cannot get the policies that we want from our government, and that's the thing that makes people want to shake things up and elect apparently strongmen.
Absolutely. So I think, look, you know, our political system is a liberal democracy, right? Now, I should always add, liberal doesn't mean liberal or conservative, right? In the sense that I talk about liberal, George W. Bush is as much of a liberal as Barack Obama, right? So what do I mean? Our political system tries to give ordinary citizens two things. The freedom to determine your own life individually, to make your own choices in life, and the freedom for all of us collectively to actually rule ourselves, right? So we need, on the one hand, individual rights, the rule of law, separation of powers, all of the things we need to make sure that there isn't a tyrant who tells us what to do. And on the other hand, some mechanism for actually translating popular views into public policies. Now, what I think we've had for a long time is a system of what I describe in the book, in The People versus Democracy, as rights without democracy. As a system in which, by and large, individual rights are relatively well respected. We have a rule of law, separation of powers works reasonably well, but the mechanism for translating popular views into public policies has increasingly broken down. And the way that I understand authoritarian populists around the world, like Donald Trump in the United States, but also like Viktor Orban in Hungary, also like Recep Erdogan in Turkey, also like Marine Le Pen in France, is as the inverse of that. It is saying, let's take back control, let's give power back to the people, but the way they do that, the way they think about politics, they may actually make the system more responsive in a certain way, but it's on the back of minorities. It's by sacrificing the rule of law. It's by sacrificing the separation of powers.
One of the other big issues you point to in the book is the multi-ethnic makeup of our societies. Our societies are changing, and the United States is becoming a more multi-ethnic place, as are all these other countries in Europe, and everyone's scared of immigration. This seems to be one of the more easily solvable problems in the book, to be honest with you. It comes off hopeful. Can you describe what you think is going on with our change in demographics?
Yeah, so if one reason why people don't trust politics, why they're angry, is that it's a pocketbook issue. It's the sense that the system isn't delivering for me. I think the form it often takes is an anger at outsiders and an anger at immigrants and a fear about the creation of a more equal multi-ethnic society. Now, that shouldn't surprise us in a certain way. When I look at European countries, I grew up in Europe, those democracies were founded as mono-ethnic, monocultural countries. When you asked somebody in Germany, somebody in Sweden, somebody in Greece in 1960, who really belongs in this society, who's a true, quote-unquote, German, Greek, Swede, they would say, well, somebody who descends ethnically from the same group as I. And obviously somebody who's brown or black or somebody who's Muslim or Hindu or for that matter Jewish doesn't belong. Now, thankfully, as European countries have experienced more immigration, we started to overcome that kind of notion. The laws have become a little bit more open. It's become easier to get citizenship. A lot of cultural conceptions have become more open as well. But you know what? This is a historically unique experiment. We haven't had other countries actually go through that transition before. And it's an experiment that does involve a certain amount of sacrifice for people. Because you get something out of being a member of a majority group in that way. You get unfair privileges, right? So for somebody, let's say in Germany, who wasn't the smartest person in the country, wasn't the most successful person in the country, it was very easy to say, well, you know what? At least I'm a part of the majority group, and I'm better than people outside the country, or I'm better than that immigrant over there. Well, you know what? That immigrant or his son or his grandson might now be your boss. He might now be the politician representing you. And that's for the good. We should celebrate that, but it shouldn't surprise us that there are people who are angry at that. Now, the situation in the United States is both similar and different. It's similar in the obvious, or it's different in the obvious sense that the United States has always been a multi-ethnic society. There's always been people of very different ethnic groups living together here. But it's similar in the sense that the United States has always been a very unequal society with a very steep racial hierarchy in which some people had huge advantages over others. Again, it's worth remembering how far we've come in remedying that, right? I don't know if it's better to be a member of a minority group today than 2 years ago, but it's certainly better to be a member of just about any minority group in the United States, whether racial or religious or ethnic, or sexual, than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. And we should take a moment to celebrate that. But once again, we should recognize that it's not really surprising that the people who thereby have to give up a bunch of advantages and privileges to which they've been accustomed since the founding of our country might be rebelling against that.
You do point out, and I always hear the idea, well, this is going to be the first country that goes from a white majority to a white minority country, and that is scaring the wits out of people. But there's parts of the country that are making the transition faster than others, and California is one of them. And you point to them as a happy success story that I enjoyed reading in the book.
Yeah, it's when you talk about the crisis of democracy and the rise of populism, the happy success stories, unfortunately, are limited in numbers, so it's worth dwelling on them where they are. It's worth thinking about the geography of populism, right? Where is that reaction against the multi-ethnic society strongest? Now, you might think that it's strongest in the places that are most diverse, right? Because that's the places where you have most people of different groups butting up against each other and so on. That's not the case. It is often in parts of a country that used to be very homogeneous and are now rapidly becoming more diverse. Not the most diverse, but more diverse. So one really striking finding is that over 2/3 of American counties were more than 90% white some 25 years ago and are now no longer more than 90% white. And that's a sort of crucial point because it's where you go from basically just having to deal with people who are a member of your ethnic and cultural group day in, day out, to quite regularly having contact with people who are different from you, who have different origins, who have a different cultural background. Now, the positive story is that you can come out on the other side. In California, in the late 80s and the early 90s, you had a moment of intense anti-immigrant state politics. But as the state became more diverse, as people became used to the fact that California was majority-minority, that has gone away and the state has actually become very liberal on immigration. And so the hope is that that might be a model for what happens in other parts of the country.
This is Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell talking with Yascha Mounk about his book, People versus Democracy. We're at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The other big driver that you talk about in our populist upheaval is media, technology, social media. It is unleashed a lot. And why is it the big driver that you identify there?
So part of the reason why it's such a big driver is that it comes on top of these other developments. But you have to look at these three things together. But one of the reasons why social media has been so disruptive is that it's in times when people are already feeling that the political system isn't delivering for them. But it comes at a moment when they're already feeling, hey, the nature of my society is changing, and perhaps I might lose something from that. But what is it? 5 years ago, everybody said social media is going to be so wonderful for democracy. It's going to overthrow all these dictatorships around the world. It's going to empower all of those marginal voices in our society. It is the best thing that ever happened to us. And now everybody is saying, no, you know what? It's only because of social media and Facebook and Twitter and all of those things that we could ever have gotten this rise of populism and so on. And so social media is actually incredibly dangerous to our democracy. It's got to be shut down. I think both of those views are overly simple. What you have to understand is that social media has changed the structural conditions of communication in our society, that it has reduced the role of gatekeepers in a way that provides some real opportunities, but also constitutes some real dangers. So if you go back 25 years, you were basically in a world of communication that in certain respects would have looked familiar to the founding fathers. And that's a world of one-to-many communication. What I mean by that is that there was a set of newspapers, publishing houses, and by then radio stations, television stations, that communicated to a ton of people. And in order to have a voice in society, you either needed to own one of those platforms or to be invited to be featured on them. All right, so what's happened in the last 25 years? First of all, you had the rise of the internet, which meant that you got the ability of everybody to buy a domain and offer their views to the whole world on a website incredibly cheaply, right? For $20 a year, you could suddenly broadcast your views to the whole world. So you had a democratized form of one-to-many communication. But it was still hard for people to find you. Why would somebody go to joeblogs.com in order to read your views? It wasn't that likely. Well, then you slowly had the transition through the rise of social media to a world of many-to-many communication. So now if you're sitting on a United Airlines flight and somebody in front of you is getting, as they say, re-accommodated, and you take a video of this and tweet it to 100 followers, well, if 10% of them retweet it, and 10% of them retweet it, and 10% of them retweet it, you might wind up with millions of people seeing this video in a matter of an hour or two, right? What this does, what this allows is for outsiders to have a much bigger view, a much bigger impact. That's a good thing in dictatorships where the democratic opposition can suddenly criticize the dictator, point out his corruption, point out abuses of power, violations of human rights. It can even be a good thing in our societies. Think of the incredible voice that survivors of a terrible school shooting in Parkland, Florida, have developed just in the last few weeks, thanks to social media. But it also obviously makes it much easier for people with extreme voices, people with hateful voices, people who are spreading lies, to have a real stake in our political system. And coming on top of the cocktail that I was talking about earlier, coming on top of people being angry at economic stagnation in any case, worried about cultural transformation, that makes a very dangerous mix.
Let's tick through real quick what to do about these three massive problems. First of all, living standards. To reform the economy, it seems like a big deal. You've got a lot of ideas about doing it. How would you go about straightening out the economic distress?
You know, the Brexiteers, the people who campaigned for the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, had a brilliant slogan, which is "Take back control." Now, to some degree, that was an anti-immigrant dog whistle. But there was something about that which actually spoke to people. Because people want to feel that, you know what, despite globalization, despite automation, I have control of my own life. I know that if I'm going to work hard, I'm still going to have a decent life 10 or 20 years from now. Right? And they also want to feel that, you know what, my nation can actually stand up tall and make sure that despite free trade and so on, corporations are going to pay tax here. We're going to be able to fund some of the social programs we need. There's a ton more that nation states can do in order to give their citizens the sense that we have control over our lives, that our nations have control over their fate. But it starts with getting much, much more aggressive about enforcing our tax laws, it would be it would be quite easy to make sure that individuals who try to hide their money in tax havens have to be very afraid of going to jail. If we actually hire more people to look for them, if we become more willing to pay for information that allows us to claw back a bunch of tax, if we raise criminal punishments for some of those things, it would be much easier to change our tax laws on corporations so that how much tax corporations pay doesn't depend on where the nominal headquarters are, so that we can't say, hey, I'm in Delaware, so I'm not paying any taxes, or I'm in Luxembourg, so I don't pay any taxes. We can do much more to increase productivity. It's about making sure that the fruits of globalization go to ordinary people, and part of that is about distribution, but a lot of it is about making sure that we have a functioning educational system that doesn't waste the talents of millions of children in the United States who go to subpar schools, and that allows people who are adults who want to improve their skills to actually have access to the money and the programs they need in order to do that. And finally, it's a matter of making sure that even people who have somewhat decent incomes don't end up spending the bulk of that money on having to pay for housing, having to pay for health, having to pay for education. So right now, actually, when you look at people's post-tax income, it's gone up somewhat. If you look at their disposable income, it is often reduced. Because if you want to live in the kind of place like Chicago, like New York, like San Francisco, where you have economic opportunity, you have to pay so much on rent that you wind up having a worse lifestyle often than your parents did.
I'm talking with Yascha Mounk about his book, People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. I want to tick through what to do about media empowerment and the lack, the kind of craziness that social media has brought. You kind of just say, tough it out, withstand it, don't censor, straighten things out a little bit. Is that really going to do the trick?
Well, it's not clear to me that censorship is going to do the trick, right? So you have a lot of attempts in European countries for the government to decide what can be said and what can't be said on platforms like Facebook and Twitter, and fining the corporations and the executives a lot of money if they don't do that. Now, the point about freedom of speech, the reason why I'm a firm believer in freedom of speech, isn't that I think every utterance is worth listening to. I think there's a whole bunch of things that are being said in our public discourse right now that have no value. I would not cry a single tear if nobody expressed those opinions. But there's not one institution in the world whom I trust to make the decision about what does have value and what doesn't have value. And that's why I get nervous when governments say, just trust me to determine what utterances are so terrible that they shouldn't have value. So that's one thing. The other thing is that when you do try as a state to shut people down, that becomes a great political weapon. All of the populists in Europe say, look, the state is trying to shut us up because we're telling the truth. Isn't that a reason for you to support us? And that's a very effective weapon. And third, the internet is a pretty freewheeling thing. And if you shut people up on some platforms, they're going to find more illicit platforms on which they can express and share those views. So I'm not even sure that you're actually effective in shutting those opinions down. So I think that, look, sure, we should have a ton of social pressure on Facebook and Twitter to enforce the pretty good community guidelines they already have. The problem is not that the guidelines are wrong. The problem is that they don't do enough to enforce them. And I think through outrage and through consumer boycotts and all of those kinds of things, we should make sure that they do. But more importantly, I think we need to not try and limit the supply of noxious opinions, which is an option that the founding fathers rightly rejected, we should reject today, but actually curb the demand for them. And one way of doing that is to fight for our values. It's to fight for the ideal of an equal multi-ethnic society, and it's to fight for what it means to live in a liberal democracy. Why, for all of the flaws in our political system, for all of the things that are going wrong in the United States today, it is much better to live in America, it is much better for that matter to live in Sweden or Germany today than it is to live in Russia or in China or in Venezuela or in Cuba. And that's something, that's a message that we need to own in a much more proud and proactive way than we have done.
How long do we have before our country turns into Venezuela, China, or Russia? You've got something called a 5-year rule in the book. You think it's about 5 years for Putin, Erdogan, and Chavez. And that's not very comforting.
We have 7 hours, 12 minutes, and 24 seconds. No, look, what you're saying is right, and that's a very serious point. That, you know, what's actually a populist, right? We've been talking about this term populist a bunch. So let me take a moment to define what I actually mean by that, right? Because it's easy to look at Donald Trump and look at Recep Erdogan, look at Viktor Orban, and look at Hugo Chavez, and say, what do they even have in common? You know, Donald Trump, you may have noticed, doesn't appear to be overly fond of Muslims. Recep Erdogan, the president of Turkey, doesn't appear to be overly fond of anybody who isn't a Muslim. There are some populists who are right-wing economically and want to slash welfare spending and, you know, cut regulations for corporations and so on. There are some, like the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, who actually you know, want to curb corporations and spend a lot more on ordinary social programs and so on. But what they have in common is an imaginary of politics in which they say, you know what, the only reason why there's real political problems is that the political class is corrupt, that they're self-serving, that they care more about outsiders and foreigners and minorities than they do about quote-unquote people like you and me. And so what we need is for somebody who truly speaks to the people to come in and write to the rescue. And I'm that guy. I'm a populist. I'm the voice of the people. And you just need to trust me. You just need to give me all of your support, and I'm going to go and fix it. Right? Well, once they're in office, you realize that it's not so easy to fix. They say things like, who knew that things could be so complicated? Who knew that healthcare was so complicated? I have a feeling that in a few months we might hear the phrase, who knew that negotiating with Kim Jong-un might turn out to be complicated? But obviously we don't want to say, hey, I was lying to you. I gave you all of these sort of wrong solutions. So instead we start to attack minorities and blame them. And they start to attack independent institutions. They say, well, you know why I haven't delivered for you? It's really simple. It's because the opposition is really unfair, and they're traitors. They don't care about the country. Why haven't I delivered for you? Because the media, they're lying all of the time, right? They're fake news, so we got to regulate them. You know why I haven't delivered for you? Because independent institutions like courts and the law enforcement agencies, they're really enemies of the American people. So to get back to your question, I know this has been a long bow. Once they do that, it gets very dangerous because they undermine the very institutions that we need in order to preserve our ability to influence politics. And what you see in countries like Hungary is that democratically elected populists, who were at one point quite popular, who did make the system more responsive, gather so much power in their own hands that it becomes impossible to displace them through democratic elections. And often the opposition retains one real chance to get rid of a populist government. Because the first time they're running for re-election, they haven't yet rigged the system to such an extent that it's impossible to win against them. Once they've gotten re-elected, they've been in power for 8 or 10 or 15 years, it gets very, very hard.
There's a constant drip, drip, drip of attack on independent institutions in almost all of these countries. And there was one in President Trump's State of the Union address that he made that really ticked you off. It seemed to slide by a lot of people, and seemed like another innocuous thing in the way. But there's a constant kind of drive to knock down institutions. And here's President Trump.
So tonight I call on Congress to empower every cabinet secretary with the authority to reward good workers and to remove federal employees who undermine the public trust or fail the American people.
What could be wrong with that? Accountability.
Define who has failed the American people and answer me the question of whether you trust any member of a cabinet to make that decision and to be able to deprive federal employees who've been in their job for decades or their livelihood at the stroke of a pen, and think about what consequences it would have to empower politicians with that kind of control over civil servants who are meant to be impartial, who are meant to serve the Constitution rather than any one political government. So this is a great example of a tactic that populists all over the world use. And make no mistake, at this point, we have an authoritarian playbook. We have a populist playbook that governments around the world are methodically following in order to undermine democratic institutions. One of the elements of that is to say that your nation is under threat from these really dangerous forces, and so you need to give absolute unquestioning loyalty to your government and to your leader in order to help him beat that threat. Another is to reward your supporters with straightforward economic handouts and so on that make them grateful to you. The Polish populist government, for example, is paying 500 zloty to any family with 2 kids every month. It turns up in your bank account and you see it and you say, okay, thanks to the government. But the third and the most important is the strategic attack on independent institutions, making sure that you don't have the separation of powers. You don't have any independent institutions that can contain the power of the executive as you usually do in a democratic system. Instead, the one person at the center of power decides everything. And they push that through always by claiming the judiciary is inefficient. There are too many bureaucrats who aren't really doing the job. So just give me a little bit of power and I'm going to solve all of that. Now, thankfully, if there was a populist Olympics, I don't think that Donald Trump would get one of the medals. He hasn't been very effective at following the populist playbook, and he hasn't been very strategic about it. He's done many of those things, but in a much more reactive, in a much more tactical manner, so that it's always about him, not about the American people. When he's tried to undermine the independence of institutions like the Department of Justice and the FBI, it hasn't been proactively by saying, hey, they're inefficient and this is a completely bipartisan, non-political way of just making the state more efficient. It's always been in the context of the Mueller probe. So thank God he hasn't followed through on that chilling line in the State of the Union. But absolutely, there was a glimpse of what populists around the world do very effectively to get the state to do their bidding.
This is Worldview on WBEZ. I'm Jerome McDonnell talking with Yascha Mounk about his book, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. We're going to get to question and answer in just a second, but I want to ask one more thing. And towards the end of the book, you talk about Donald Trump or an individual populist as being part of a possibly larger issue that goes on for a long time. And you use the old Roman Empire as an example of they knocked back one, and then another one popped up 10 years later, and then another one popped up 10 years later, and that's how you get the fall of the Roman Empire, and that is the thing that could happen now. So,
it is difficult in our politics at the moment to think about anything other than Donald Trump. It's an entertaining show. He's always been good at entertaining shows. And so it's easy to start thinking that what I would call the crisis of our political system is all about one figure and the way in which he's polarizing the country. But what you see when you look around the world is that populists like Donald Trump exist in many different countries. This kind of political energy has been rising for many decades, and it has these deeper causes that we've been talking about today. So, yeah, there is a threat that the independence of our institutions is going to be attacked so strongly over the next years that we no longer have effectively free and fair elections by 2020 or by 2024. We need to take that threat seriously and guard our institutions against it. But the much deeper threat, I think, is that we're seeing the first wave of a whole series of waves of attacks on our democratic system. And there, as you said, Jerome, the clear precedent is the Roman Republic, where in the late 2nd century, you had Tiberius Gracchus come to power, fueled by deep resentment against the inability of a state to do more for people economically, fueled by fears about the expansion of the Roman Empire. And for a little while, things were really scary. You had a big constitutional crisis. In the end, Gracchus loses power. Things go back to normal for about 10 years. But the underlying reasons for the anger, the underlying reasons for that instability aren't being solved. And so you get his brother being elected. You get another moment of constitutional crisis. It goes back again for a little bit to being calm. And over the course of 20, 50, 100 years, the political system collapses. This is possible here as well. I mean, look, it's easy to say we've had a constitutional government for 250 years. So why on earth would it collapse now? Well, you know, democracy in Athens lasted for 200 years. The Roman Republic lasted for 500 years. The Serenissima Repubblica di San Marco, the most serene republic of Venice, lasted for 1,000 years. And anybody who at towards the end of those systems of government would have said, hey, don't you think that things are looking pretty scary right now and things aren't as stable as they once were? Perhaps this is the moment where the system collapses. Would have been laughed out of court. People would have said, what are you talking about? For hundreds of years, this has been stable. And yet they did collapse. So I think we have to take that danger very seriously and understand that in order to beat that danger, it's not a matter of beating one or another political candidate or leader. It's a matter of solving some of the driving, underlying causes that have caused people to be so angry about our politics.
Let's do some questions from the audience and from people. You can walk up to the microphone and ask your question yourself. I've got a few that are piping into me here. And there's a question here about mapping out possible scenarios after the midterm election, Democratic gains versus one-party rule of more one-party rule of U.S. government. How important are the midterm elections? We just had a primary here, and everybody thought it was very important in the media, but the turnout was not great. I mean, the primary, what was the number? It was like 20% in the city or something, 30%. Is the midterms important?
I personally think that it's very important because the thing that populists try to do is to concentrate power in their own hands, to make sure that there's no real countervailing force, and certainly no countervailing force that is seen to have any legitimacy. So I do think that, not for partisan reasons, not because I happen to prefer the Democratic policy platform to the Republican one, but because I see attacks on the independence of institutions like the FBI and the Department of Justice, it's really important to have an active counter voice in Congress, one that actually carries out investigations in good faith, and one that is able to stop the appointment of people, say, to the position of Attorney General, who aren't committed to the Constitution as they are supposed to be, but of doing the bidding of the chief executive. And so yes, it seems to me that it's very, very important for people to get engaged in the midterms, to vote in the midterms, even if, you just mentioned the primaries, perhaps their favorite candidate did not win, perhaps they, wish that it was somebody else on the ballot. Well, when it comes to resisting authoritarian takeover, the most important thing is that the people who are opposed to that are actually capable of making coalitions, even ideologically diverse ones, even across deep disagreements of policy, because they are committed together to protecting the independence of the most important political institutions. So yes, I think it's very important that that happen.
Sir, your question.
Yes, so in mentioning Rome and, for the past few thousand years, there's been this cycling and ascendancy between totalitarianism and forces of democracy. To what extent, through that period, has it been that when under a totalitarian regime, over time, people, the memory fades of what the negative aspects of that were. And to what extent are we experiencing now a diminution of the the public memory of living under the Cold War and World War II?
So when you look at the fact that 2/3 of older Americans born in the 1930s, 1940s say it's absolutely essential to live in a democracy, but less than 1/3 of younger Americans born since 1980 do, I think what you mentioned is an obvious reason for that. That older Americans have a sense of what it meant to fight against fascism. They had a sense of what it meant to have a totalitarian force in the form of the Soviet Union play a real role in world politics. What it meant to have to live in a place like the Soviet Union. Whereas younger people don't understand that. And so they say, hey, I see all of these problems in our society, and there are deep problems in our society. So let's try something new. How bad could things get? And of course, things can get very bad. And that's why I would add a second thing, which is that it's tempting to think of the threat to democracy as being very explicit and perhaps even caricatural. When we think of a place where democracy died, we tend to think of, say, Germany in 1933. But actually, if you've studied how democratic systems perished, it's rarely been through people who openly call themselves anti-democratic, who march through the center of town, doing Nazi salutes and wearing big shiny black boots and having sort of torches that are on fire that they parade around. It's often through people who say, hey, the current system isn't really responding to you. You know what? I'm more democratic than everybody else, right? I'm going to actually be your voice. Just trust me. Just give me a little bit more power so I can really clean up this mess, and you'll see everything will be great.
Erdogan and Chavez, super democratic guys.
Exactly.
Sir.
Thank you very much. It's kind of a follow-up to this question and the last question. And on one of your podcasts, when you had Francis Fukuyama, he had mentioned, or maybe admitted, that Donald Trump had kind of piqued his interest early on, and that he was this populist without a political ideology on the left or right. So maybe he could help, shake us from this, liberal democratic malaise and restart history again. And Fukuyama's kind of, I think, posited that in the conversation with you. So my question is, do you think there is this malaise that needs to be shaken? And if so, how do you diminish all the negatives of the chaos and kind of retain the strength of the institutions? And in many ways, if people have rejected a technocrat, can we, is there a populist message that could possibly, lead us in that direction?
If a stop clock is right twice a day, I feel like populists perhaps are right 3 or 4 times a day. And they tend to be more right in their analysis than in the solutions they suggest. So here's what populists more or less tend to be right about. That the political system isn't responsive enough to the views of ordinary people. That the rich have too much power in our politics. That too much of the economic gains around the world are going to the very rich rather than to ordinary people. And I absolutely think that we need to do something about that. Now, the optimistic view of populism is that they're going to help us do that, because they'll come and actually change things and care more about ordinary people, and that they will force ordinary parties, old-fashioned politicians, to actually care more about their voters. I don't think that that's how it tends to go. When you look around the world, populists actually end up stealing a lot of money in most places, enriching themselves and their close associates, failing to deliver for the base economically in many places. And they make it much harder for establishment parties to rule effectively, because they no longer have the majorities they used to, because the political system becomes so polarized, and so on and so forth. Now, I do think that in most countries, more moderate political forces have a last chance. They can come back to rule in the United States. They're still in power in most of Western Europe. So they now need to deliver. They need to actually reform themselves and clean up the political system. They need to ensure that most of the gains from free trade, from globalization, go to ordinary people. And there are things they can do to do that. The 2016 election, in my personal view, was a choice between an extremist politics of change and a moderate politics of a status quo. Under those circumstances, an extremist politics won. And it's not because most Americans are extremists, it's because they really want to change. So the best way to fight against the populists is to offer a moderate politics of change, a politics that actually reimagines how things work and how we can deliver for citizens, but without embracing the ideological extremes.
My question is about what you think of the upcoming census and the change of the question that is added about citizenship and how this will impact the future in particular states like California.
So look, I think obviously people are reluctant to share their citizenship status on a government form if they might be undocumented or they have things to fear from that. The census is a really important tool to understand what's going on in our country, to get information about the state of our country. And so anything that makes the census unreliable is very worrying and is very bad. I think that some of the political consequences that are being sort of claimed this will have may be exaggerated. I think there's ways of dealing with that if you had good political will, but it's just one of many examples in which the desire to exert more political control and to get your way on a particular policy issue has been more important than the desire for good governance, or frankly the desire to understand and establish the truth. So I find it as worrying as a sign, as an example of a style of politics, as I do for the concrete consequences it's going to have.
I want to ask a quick question about young people. We just had this enormous demonstration that was inspired by young people. And I think whenever there's change in the country, oftentimes it's the young people who are out there first. In your book, you talk about the young people will not save us. And you cite a lot of data about their disengagement from politics. Can't we be a little hopeful about these?
We can be a little hopeful, and one of the hopeful things actually is that whereas young people used to be very open to a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with Congress or elections, it's turned out that the best advertisement for democracy is one Donald Trump. That in the last data set we got a few months ago, young people actually are starting to reject the idea of that kind of strong leader because they associate it with Donald Trump. But when you look beyond the United States, it's quite clear that young people can absolutely be open for forms of populist politics. In France, over 50% of young people in the first round of the presidential elections last year voted for either Marine Le Pen, the candidate of the far-right populist party, or for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the candidate of the far-left populist party. In the recent Italian elections a couple of months ago, the extreme populist parties, the League, Five-Star Movement, were much more popular among the young than among older voters. So when I look at the United States, I think that young people are very deeply disenchanted with politics, that sometimes they channel that into mass movements that can be productive, but that aren't exactly traditional political activity, and that there's a huge reservoir of frustration and of anger that is yet to be exploited there. Donald Trump is not the right person to exploit it. He doesn't particularly try to appeal to young people for all kinds of reasons. But I could absolutely imagine some political candidate in the United States binding that energy in a way that is similar to what we are seeing in France and Italy.
Sir.
Is one of the problems is that some of your so-called moderates who support democracy also support economic austerity and laissez-faire economics, meaning giving corporations everything, and at the same time these same people support democracy. That's really creating the ground for those kind of extremists.
Well, yes, I agree that it's a huge problem that moderate parties have become very comfortable with a system, for example, that requires congressmen to spend 50% of their time fundraising rather than serving their constituents. That's absolutely right. Now, by the way, I want to
What I mean by austerity, I'm referring to like they want to cut the social programs or give corporations the free rein, the so-called moderates.
Well, I mean, I think it depends on who you're talking about there. I think the Democratic Party in the United States doesn't try to do that. It's introduced, the last time it had real political power, more medical care for most Americans. It has tried to expand a bunch of social programs, to extend unemployment programs, and so on and so forth. So it really depends on what you're talking about. I think there's a larger question here, which is that I'm sometimes asked, isn't the only way to save democracy to abolish capitalism? Isn't really capitalism the problem? And I want to say a few things to that. First of all, that there actually hasn't been a democratic country in the world that wasn't capitalist. There's no example of that in the history of the world. And secondly, that if you're on the right politically, you might say, I still think you'd be wrong, but you might say, hey, I only care about Americans, and for them, getting rid of things like free trade might be pretty good, because look, the income of the average steelworker in Michigan really hasn't particularly gone up in the last 20 or 30 years. I think actually if we change our tax laws, if we change our welfare state programs, free trade can be very good for the steelworker in Michigan as well. But I see the point. If you're on the left and you say that you care for the well-being of people, not just in the United States, but also in other countries, it's very difficult to say that the last 20 or 30 years of globalization and free trade haven't been an enormous boon to the world. There are 2 billion people in countries like India and Vietnam and China who were in dire poverty a few decades ago, who didn't have access to electricity, to education, who didn't know whether they would have anything to eat at night, who are now members of the middle class, who have an education, who have a decent standard of living. And that absolutely is an achievement of globalization and of free trade and of a capitalist system. Now, some countries have done much better at making sure that their average citizens have huge gains than the United States. The difference is not that we are capitalists and they're not. The difference is that they have a political system that isn't captured by the interests of the rich, and therefore they've pursued public policies that favor ordinary citizens rather than huge corporations.
Thank you. I want to sneak in a quick question from the board here. We've talked mostly about the US and Europe. There was one about India there, and you mentioned India and Mr. Modi quite a bit in the book. It's a great big multi-party democracy that is playing around with the same thing everybody else is.
And it's one of the ways in which this populist movement truly has global appeal, right? Even in countries like India, you see the incredible strengthening of authoritarian political leaders who play on ethnic and religious divisions, undermine the tradition of tolerance that that country had in ways that are pretty scary. Now, what you see there is an interesting point about the economics of populism. One of the responses I sometimes get is to say, hey, when you look at how much somebody earns, it doesn't give you a straightforward prediction of whether they voted for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And that's true. The average voter for Donald Trump is a little richer than the average voter for Hillary Clinton. But what you very clearly see is a geographic dimension to populism. That people voted for Donald Trump in parts of a country that are much less affluent, in parts of a country that have had less recent economic investment, where there's fewer qualified people, even where the share of jobs that might be automated away is higher than in other parts of a country. And this is something that you see even in a country like India, which, yes, has had a real improvement of living standards because it had a lot of economic growth, as I was saying. But where do people vote for Modi? It's not in the most affluent parts of the country. It's not in the big urban centers. It is in the parts of the country that feel that they are being left behind, that they're not doing as well as the parts of the country that are really thriving.
Ma'am.
Following up on this very idea of where the support for populist leaders comes from, my question is both general, societal, but also very personal. I think we've all heard that, polarity in our society is growing and partisanship is on the rise, and we all see that and agree to that. And the general remedy is always touted, we need to reach out and talk to each other more and, figure things out. How do we make it work? And I'm just really struggling, having tried to do that. Do you have any recommendations, or having studied populism for so long, like how do these movements fail, and how do you, sort of take those supporters back into the fold of liberal democracy?
So the first thing I would say is that we really have to understand the importance of going beyond policy disagreements, right? There's a very important distinction between a political adversary and a political enemy. You can say it is absolutely essential that I win the election and that you lose. I think I have a much better set of values. I have a much better set of ideas about how to improve this country. And I really want my candidate to win, or if I am running for office, I really want you to vote for me. That's fine. That's part of ordinary democratic politics. But you've got to accept the legitimacy of your political opponent. You've got to say, if he wins, if she wins, that's okay as well, because I'm going to have another chance to win 4 years later. And that's part of our democratic system. I think John McCain expressed that distinction beautifully in a town hall a few weeks before the 2008 election, in which somebody in the audience stood up and said, Barack Obama is an Arab, he's a dangerous man, and if he wins, I'm scared for America. And McCain said, look, I want you to vote for me. I think I have a better idea for how to rule America. I think I'd make a much better president. But you know what? Barack Obama is an honorable man. And if he wins, if he becomes president, you don't have to be scared for your country. McCain there was policing the distinction between an adversary and an enemy. And at a time where I do think that our most basic political institutions are actually under attack, it becomes all the more crucial that we can work together with anybody who might be an adversary in normal times, but who's not an enemy, to actually make a political bridge to anybody who's willing to defend the values of liberal democracy, defend the separation of powers. They might vote for a tax law you hate. They might vote to repeal health insurance in a way that you find morally disgraceful. But as long as they are willing to defend our institutions against takeover by an authoritarian populist, you need to be able to at least form a temporary alliance with them. Not because you love them, not because you agree with them, but because you want to get back to a moment when you can spend most of your enemy fighting them, rather than somebody who's much, much scarier to our consensus, to our ability to actually rule together. Now, how do you reach people who actually don't care about our political institutions, who actually want to give up the values of liberal democracy? You try and talk to them about our political values. You can try and explain why it's better to live in a liberal democracy than in a place like China or Venezuela or Turkey. You can try and show how dangerous it is when you've undermined the separation of powers, what it allows authoritarian rulers and dictators to do to the lives of ordinary people. So don't denounce them, don't shout at them, try and have a conversation, try and convince them, but also be very clear about what your values are and why you think that they are dangerous for our country.
We'll do 2 more questions. Sir.
Sir, how do you see the future of the European Union?
That's an easy question. Well, I think Europe is in a very peculiar political moment in which actually in some ways people are quite happy with where we're at. I think people in a certain way are happy to have the euro in most of Europe. They're happy to be able to travel across borders within Europe without having to show their passports. They might not like the degree to which political decisions have been put in the hands of the European Union, but actually the really important decisions are still made at the national level. The problem is that the status quo is not very sustainable, because the structural problems of the euro haven't been solved. The next time you have a big economic crisis, all of that stuff is going to start up again. You'll have the next iteration of the euro crisis. And the only 2 ways of solving it are either to go towards much more political harmonization in Europe, delegating many more economic powers to Brussels, which is something that nobody really wants, or to somehow dismantle the euro, which nobody knows how to do without giant economic chaos, and which actually is a big step backwards, but people don't really want to take either. So I think that the European Union faces a much deeper set of challenges than most people want to acknowledge or admit. And it worries me that now, as thankfully the economy is starting up again and the dismal economic decade of Southern Europe is starting to give way to a little bit of growth there, everybody wants to say, there's no more problems, everything is solved, let's just go on as we are. And I think that that's quite a dangerous course of action.
Last question.
Yeah, I would like to come back to social media for a second. I agree with your analysis of the, let's say, advantages and disadvantages, opportunities, and I would also say that it's problematic to somehow censor content on social media. But I mean, given the scandal, I would say, around Cambridge Analytica, we have seen breaking out in the US and also in Europe. I mean, also the Brexiteers have been using that. I mean, shouldn't there be some form of limitation to this new elite, this information elite that controls a lot of power? And I mean, is it possible at all to rein in on that in any way?
Yeah, so first of all, we don't have all of the facts yet, but if it turns out that Facebook broke the law, then they need to be punished for breaking the law. The second thing is that, we should be very careful to ensure that, the people who own platforms that are so crucial to our civic conversation don't get to favor some views over others in various ways. And I think there's things we can do to ensure some form of fair access to those kinds of platforms. What I don't think we should do is to actually censor. What I don't think we should do is to give governments the power to decide what can and can't be said on those platforms. Because, as I was saying earlier, I don't trust them with the ability to determine what's a worthwhile political utterance. And that's an especially urgent problem at a moment at which authoritarian populists are actually within striking distance of government in many countries, or even in government in many countries. I wouldn't want Marine Le Pen, if she ever won the French presidency, to be able to decide what you are allowed to say on a social media platform in France. Now, I want to finish by saying something a little bit more optimistic. You've been pushing me to say more optimistic things, and I know that I sometimes can sound a little depressing, so I don't want to end on a depressing note. Look, I'm actually, in a strange way, energized by everything that's going on. When I was growing up and coming of age politically, I thought that the stakes of politics were high, that there's very important issues about which we have deep disagreements, but that they were limited. But I knew more or less what the United States, what Germany, what Sweden would look like 20 or 30 years from now. Now I think we really face a much more existential set of stakes. And that's scary. But it's also empowering. Because unlike the citizens of countries like China and Cuba and Venezuela and Russia, we still retain the freedom and the ability to fight for our values. I went to a talk a few months ago by the writer Amos Oz. And he said, there's a big fire burning. And all we have is a little glass of water. And it can feel futile to take that glass of water and pour it on the fire, because the fire is far too big to be extinguished by one glass of water. But you know what? There's a ton of us. There's a ton of us in this room. There's a ton listening to this radio show. There's a ton of people who care about our values, who want to defend our political system. And if all of us take our own glass of water and pour it on the fire, then together we might just be able to extinguish it. So, yes, living in scary times gives us a lot of responsibility, but it also affords us an opportunity to do something that's truly important and impactful. So let's live up to our civic duty and do that.
Yascha Mounk, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It. I want to thank everybody here at the Council for having us here. Thanks to Ian Whitaker, Joe Palermo, Victoria Williams, and everybody at the Council for setting up a great program this evening. And on the BEZ side, thanks to M.K. Nadelson and the usual crowd at Worldview, Steve Bynum, Julian Haida, Anna Walters, and Galilee Abdullah. I'm Jerome McDonnell. You've been listening to Worldview on WBEZ.
That was fun.